So we're holding this teach-in for a simple reason. We will not succeed in fighting fascism, nor in building a world able to resist the easy temptations of fascist logics if we do not understand what fascism is or why it is such a powerful and recurring through line in our culture. We all think we understand it, of course. The period in Europe when openly fascist powers rose in Italy and Germany, occupied large parts of the continent, perpetrated mass murder on an unfathomable scale, has been exhaustively studied. We all learned about it in school, we saw the films, we visited the museums. Yet these understandings were clearly lacking in some fundamental ways because, well, here we are. Fascism is having a major comeback. Concentration camps are having a comeback. Mob violence is having a comeback. Book banning is having a comeback. Openly supremacist ideologies are having a comeback from Israel to Italy, India to the US to Germany itself. And in Gaza, genocide is back before the eyes of the world, relentless and unending. We have failed the fascism test. We, meaning our political leaders and our most powerful institutions. The case I want to make to you is that the reason for that failure is that the dominant and official story of what fascism was and is was profoundly faulty. There were huge pieces missing, specifically pieces that told us where Italian and German fascists got their supremacist ideas from, as well as their bogus race science, as well as their legal and military techniques. They did not come out of thin air in Europe in the 1920s. On the contrary, they came from places like the one we are gathered today, as you heard from Ruben. They came from the experience and practice of settler colonialism, racial apartheid, and imperialist depravities. Not metaphorically, but materially, traceably, directly. These missing parts of the history matter, because if we don't understand the root systems of fascism, and too many with power clearly do not, then we don't actually understand fascism. And without that understanding, its logics will continue to reproduce, replicate, and shapeshift. It is happening already with dizzying speed. I don't know about you, but the education I received about the Nazi Holocaust went something like this. The Nazis, we were told, were an elemental evil force that is the mirror opposite of everything that the enlightened liberal West believes itself to stand for. Uniform to our pluralist, closed to our open, authoritarian to our democratic, and so on. Elia Ayub, who writes the excellent Hauntologies newsletter, refers to this depoliticized history as the Captain America beating up the Nazis story, right? It's all over there. In this cartoonish account, Nazism emerges out of a unique and explosive combination of forces. Germany's humiliation after its defeat in World War I was compounded by the economic hardships of the Great Depression, creating a powerful desire for a scapegoat. This unleashed the hounds of anti-Semitism, a deep and primordial hatred that is often set apart from other forms of race hatred. All of this created the rupture in the time and space continuum that was the Nazi Holocaust. That's a story I heard. And according to this dominant story, that rupture was sealed once again with the defeat of the Nazis by the Allied forces, many of them settler colonial states like this one, and also by the creation of the State of Israel, which billed itself and was billed by West Germany when it subsidized Israel's early state building as a form of reparations for the horrors suffered by the Jewish people in the Nazi Holocaust. Now, there have always been other ways of understanding the Nazis' exterminatory project, counter-narratives, other explanations of where it came from, left out of those dominant histories. And there, of course, have always been very different understandings of Zionism. These alternative histories have been told in the Global South, in the places with first-hand experience with European imperialism, and they have been told in the South, in the North, in Black, Indigenous, and in many immigrant communities in North America. And we're going to be hearing from many scholars of these alternative histories today. In these analyses, the Nazi Holocaust is not understood as a rupture in space and time, nor as a novel innovation born solely of primordial Jew hatred. Rather, it is understood as a homecoming of the violent exterminatory logics and methods that European powers had directed at those they deemed savage and devilish since the Spanish Inquisition, logics that for more than 500 years mostly ravaged lands and bodies outside of Europe's borders in the colonies. But in the 1930s, those logics and methods boomeranged back to Europe and were unleashed on large segments of the European population, with the subhumans being exterminated no longer restricted to Africans or indigenous peoples in the Americas, but also Europeans. Europeans who were gay, disabled, autistic, Roma, communist, and on an unfathomable scale, Jewish. One of the most important voices in these early debates was the US intellectual and civil rights leader, W.E.B. Du Bois. In The World in Africa, published at the close of the Second World War, he observed that there was no Nazi atrocity, concentration camps, wholesale maiming and murder, defilement of women, or ghastly blasphemy of childhood, which Christian civilizations of Europe had not long been practicing against colored folk in all parts of the world in the name of and for the defense of a superior race born to rule the world. This perspective was echoed by the Martinican anti-colonial author and politician Aimé Césaire, who is credited with that boomerang image that I quoted earlier. In his influential text, Discourse on Colonialism, first published in 1950, he rejected the flattering narrative that Nazism was some kind of alien force that had invaded Europe. On the contrary, he wrote, Europeans, and this is a quote, tolerated Nazism before it was inflicted on them. Until these methods returned to European soil, they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had been applied only to non-European peoples. Yet seen from his perch in the Caribbean, where indigenous peoples had been slaughtered to make way for enslaved Africans, whom European colonists terrorized into brutal labor, it was all one long, continuous, snaking story, genocide after genocide. Césaire also wrote that in his view, Hitler was not merely the enemy of the United States and the United Kingdom, but he was their shadow, the part of themselves they could not bear to see. And here you have this quote that you see, yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism and to reveal to the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century that without his being aware of it, he has Hitler inside him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon. So some of you are familiar with this analysis, and I know some of you may be hearing about it for the first time. But I want to stress that this was not marginal. As early as 1939, Jawaharlal Nehru, who would go on to become Prime Minister of India, traveled to Europe, so this is 39, and saw fascism's rise for himself. He returned home to British-controlled India with striking observations. Quote, fascism is only employing in Europe the methods employed by imperialism and other continents. Fascism is a mirror of the past and to a certain extent the present of imperialism. So I believe that this is fascism's true arc. It doesn't begin in the 20s or 30s in Europe. It stretches backwards in time before then into Europe's colonies. Fascism, Nehru wrote, is, quote, nothing but the application to home countries of the principles which imperialism has already tried in Asia. So none of this is to conflate the very real differences between these genocidal chapters of scale, temporality, technique, technology. So we should be approaching these differences with curiosity. They deserve our attention and respect. Yet we also need to recognize the clear and recurring patterns, the genocidal logics that do stretch through all of these chapters across time and space. And there's another source that we should consider about where the Nazis drew their inspiration, and that's the Nazis themselves. Hitler spoke and wrote extensively about the many ways in which he modeled his genocidal regime after various European colonial and settler colonial regimes. For instance, in 1941, he remarked, quote, "Concentration camps were not invented in Germany. It is the English who are their inventors, using this institution to gradually break the backs of other nations." And of course, this was true. He didn't mention that they had also been used by the Germans themselves in the country's African continents, just 25 years before Hitler rose to power. The atrocities widely understood as the first genocide of the 20th century took place in what is now Namibia, with the mass slaughter of the Nama and Herero, or Over-Herero people. So I want to take a few minutes with this and go into a little detail, because it highlights the prehistory of Nazism, that backwards arc that we're delving into so vividly. In the late 1800s, Germany determined that it needed room to live and grow, its infamous quest for Lebensraum, which was not invented by Hitler. It was really, it emerged in Germany, in the German colonists who established missions in Southwest Africa. In the defining act of settler colonialism, the German colonists pushed the Nama and Herero people off of their lands and into the desert, causing great desperation. Eventually and predictably, the Herero fought back and staged a rebellion, one that included the killing of around 150 German settlers, which was actually a very high percentage since the colonies were only a few thousand people at the time. Germany responded to this with genocidal fury. In addition to massacres, they deliberately starved the Herero and Nama people, cut them off from their water sources, leading to mass death from dehydration. The governor of the German colony at the time was General Lothar von Trotha, who you see there, and he issued this famous declaration for extermination. Those who survived this first phase were corralled into newly built concentration camps and forced into labor. The deadliest of the camps was on Shark Island, and you can see the monument that stands there now, and one of the things that's striking is that we all know that in Germany there are so many monuments to the Nazi Holocaust, but there are no monuments to the Nama and Herero genocides. This is the only major monument. On Shark Island, each prisoner was assigned a number, which, that careful accounting was a prototype that would come to mark the German concentration camps, with the assigning of numbers and the tattooing of numbers onto every person in the camp. And there were other lines of connection between the genocides. Doctors and other scientists from Germany traveled to the camps in Southwest Africa to conduct medical experiments on the Nama and Herero people, mostly involving measuring their skulls. They were, in fact, obsessed with skulls and sent hundreds, if not thousands, of them back to be studied and displayed in German educational and cultural institutions. By the time the camps were closed in 1908, 80% of the Herero people had been exterminated, and roughly 50% of the Nama people. So these were death camps. The most horrific detail of the genocide, and another foreshadowing of the atrocities soon to come in the Nazi camps, was the way the Germans forced prisoners to participate in the desecration of their kin. To ready the skulls for shipping, prisoners were made to boil them and clean them with shards of glass. Now, the reason behind this obsession with skulls is that Germans were trying to prove that African skulls were smaller, which they were not. But this so-called research was an early instance of the bogus race science that formed the basis of the entire Nazi project. The lines of connection between these two chapters are direct. For instance, one of the most active experimenters and skull collectors in Southwest Africa was Dr. Eugene Fischer. Hitler read his research when he was in prison and quoted it in Mein Kampf. Once the Nazis came to power, Fischer, who had been collecting those skulls, joined the Nazi party. There you see him there doing an Elon Musk salute. So Fischer adapted his racial purity theories that he developed in Africa and just kind of did a search and replace for Jews and came up with this theory of Jewish blood poisoning the Aryan blood. He also trained several SS doctors, including the so-called Angel of Death, Joseph Mengele. Mengele was known for his gruesome experiments with twins in Auschwitz, done once again with the forced assistance of Jewish prisoners. As with the Nama and Herero, Jewish and Roma skulls and other body parts were measured and experimented upon and preserved for German study. So were the brains of neurodivergent children. So this is not 6 degrees of separation between a colonial genocide in Africa and a fascist genocide in Europe. This is no degrees of separation. As César clearly saw, what happened in the colonies soon boomeranged back to the metropole. The Nazis also drew inspiration from further afield, including from the racial apartheid that reigned in the United States at the time the Nazis were formulating their ideology and systems of domination. And Hitler also drew direct inspiration from the treatment of indigenous people here in Canada and the US. So like most North Americans and most Europeans, I learned none of this as part of my elementary or high school education, and frankly, my undergraduate education. I received a lot of Holocaust education, but I didn't learn this. Did any of you learn this when you were, yeah. I didn't think so. In fact, I barely learned about the Indigenous genocide in Canada, certainly not in any detail and with a sense of common humanity between the victims or survivors. That has changed, thankfully, to a degree. Children in public schools across Canada learn about the cruelties and depravities of the so-called residential school system in Canada, starting in kindergarten. They read picture books about how Indigenous children who attended the schools were forced to cut long braids and prevented from speaking their languages or practicing their ceremonies. In later grades, they hear about the thousands of unmarked graves that have been confirmed on the former grounds of those so-called schools, including here in BC. But unless they go to truly extraordinary schools with extraordinary teachers, this knowledge will not be connected with what they are taught about the Nazis and the Holocaust, or apartheid in South Africa, or the Jim Crow South. Common patterns that connect these different violent chapters will not be identified. Even in our universities, Holocaust studies are still largely cordoned off from genocide studies, from studies of enslavement and apartheid and racial capitalism, from the study of settler colonialism and imperialism in Palestine, which may be why, or part of why, over the past horrifying 18 months, so many of us have found ourselves completely unable to speak to a great many of our coworkers and colleagues about what we see happening in Gaza. Because perhaps, and now we're having this phenomenon of people who can identify fascism in Trump, but are still unable to see it in Israel or in Canada's own history. It's as if we're speaking different languages, and in many ways we are. We have been kept in our silos, our understandings of the world severed from one another. Indeed, comparisons are often expressly forbidden, smeared as attempts to diminish atrocities, and I think we've all heard this. These severings between genocidal histories did not happen by accident. They happened by design. Of course, the Allied powers who defeated the Nazis, including Canada, did not want to confront what the Nazis had learned from us, because that would have meant confronting their own bloody histories and reckoning with the enormous debts owed from colonialism and enslavement. And of course, supporters of political Zionism didn't want these pasts connected either, because to confront the myriad ways that the Nazis were shaped by settler colonialism would have meant that the creation of a specifically Jewish nation-state on very much inhabited Palestinian lands never was or could be reparations, but was rather the tragic logic of replication. These deliberate erasures and forgettings have come at a terrible, incalculable price. They have deprived far too many of us of the vital tools we all need to recognize fascist threats before they devolve into genocidal violence. And we also see the cost of these forgettings in the ways that Israel's fascist methodologies are coming back to the nations that have offered Israel their steadfast support, from ideological cover to 2,000-pound bombs. We see it in the form of kidnapping of international students from US campuses for writing op-eds or liking Free Palestine posts or leading peaceful protests. We see it in the wholesale attacks on inconvenient science and research, and on US border agents suddenly claiming that their job is to protect the nation from dangerous ideas. We see it in so many other ways that we'll be unpacking today. As Noura Erakat wrote recently, the boomerang has once again come back to the metropole, only now at the speed of digital media. One thing is clear. If we do not finally face fascism's colonial roots, fascism's long arc will continue well into the future. And as Rula Jabrial just warned us, the genocide in Gaza will become a global doctrine. This is what Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, has been saying now for a year and a half, that in Gaza's unfolding genocide, the poorest and most vulnerable nations in the world are seeing what they fear is a glimpse of their own future. Petro said this early, placing Israel's attacks in the context of the global war waged by the rich against the poor, one that is intensifying in every part of the world in the era of climate breakdown, which is why a Climate Justice Center is hosting this teach-in. With migrants left to die rather than cross our increasingly fortressed national borders or sent to offshore camps and dungeons like the now notorious Secat in El Salvador. Petro is warning us that the arc of fascism is already reaching forward into a present and future of extreme border violence, bunkered billionaires, and climate apartheid. He called it Global 1933. This statement, though chilling, points to an important reality, one that we just heard expressed by Judith Butler, Pankaj Mishra, Keeanga-Yamada Taylor in their video messages to us. Despite very real historical echoes, nothing is foretold. History, as Keeanga said, is cumulative. It doesn't play on a loop. It spirals, picking up weight and velocity, even has the power to turn victims into victimizers. One difference between 1933 and 2025, as we heard, is that we do know what happened in 1933. We also know what is happening right now in Gaza. We know not only about the horrors, but also about the failures of connections and solidarity that enabled those horrors, made them possible and thinkable, are still doing that. So this quote the students chose for the program, and I think it's a good grounding for us from Christina Sharp, that we gather in this time of catastrophe matters, that we speak in this time of catastrophe matters. We can choose to use these spaces to learn from past mistakes, to evolve, not to repeat those failures of solidarity, to strategize about how we might do that. We can choose to build the broadest, deepest, and most strategic anti-fascist coalitions possible. Indeed, it is our gravest responsibility to do so. I think there's another reason for hope. These siloed accounts of history aren't staying in their boxes anymore. You being here is a testament to that. And a generation of young people, the encampment generation, has insisted on making all of these forbidden connections, on seeing the patterns, which is precisely why those students, especially international students, who bring anti-colonial histories with them, are under such ferocious attack. It's also why our universities are under attack, why our engaged anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist scholarship is under attack, and it is why EDI is under attack. It is why trans bodies are under attack. It is why land acknowledgements are now under attack, and why residential school denialism is surging here in British Columbia and Canada. Our opponents know it's all connected, and they act like it. We know it's all connected, but we don't always act like it. Let's change that. Thank you.